Why do people speak in innuendo when they're on a date? Why do dictators try to squelch protests? Why do we join up with bullies to gang up on an outcast? Why do humans stand out from the rest of the animal kingdom by blushing and laughing and crying? And what does any of this have to do with George Costanza, or When Harry Met Sally, or anonymity on social media, or cancel culture, or why we generally don't say everything we mean? Welcome to Inner Cosmos with me, David Eagleman. I'm a neuroscientist and author at Stanford. And in these episodes, we sail deeply into our 3-pound universe to understand why and how our lives look the way they do. Today's episode is about a phenomenon known as common knowledge, which is something that I know and you know, and we both know that we know it. Now, this could seem like a very particular sort of thing to pay attention to, but many psychologists and economists over the past decades have started to think that a deeper understanding of common knowledge could explain all kinds of things about human nature and behavior and societies. And for a very long time, this has grabbed the attention of my friend and colleague, Steven Pinker, who just this week has a new book coming out on common knowledge called When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows. And so I called him up to discuss this topic. I'll take just a moment to frame this before I begin the interview. At the heart of the issue is that we are a massively social species. We form lifelong relationships, and we join clubs, and we're parts of tribes, and we're citizens of countries. And we're also a highly intelligent species, and we spend a lot of our time, usually unconsciously, figuring out who knows what and what we know in common. And for that matter, thinking about how we can expand common knowledge with the right signals, and often how we could hide things from becoming common knowledge. The key thing to understand for today's conversation is that common knowledge is not just about a bunch of individuals each knowing something. It's that each person knows it and knows that everyone else knows it and knows that everyone else knows that they know it, and so on. And the argument is that it's this ladder of shared awareness that allows societies to coordinate. So think about something like the game of chicken, where two drivers speed towards each other. Each knows the situation, but the critical factor is whether both drivers know what the other is willing to do, and whether both know that the other knows. And the effects of common knowledge stretch from two people all the way up to countries. For example, history is filled with moments when private thoughts turned into common knowledge and changed the world. So for example, in 1989, East Germans had long doubted the regime, but it was only when tens of thousands gathered in the streets, when everyone could see that everyone else had the same doubts, that's when the Berlin Wall fell. Stock market bubbles and crashes run on this same sort of principle. Investors don't care only about the value of a stock, but about what everyone else believes about its value. So this is the type of thing that Pinker's book explores, all the ways in which common knowledge permeates everyday life. Common knowledge, for example, is why etiquette works. You don't just know the rules, you know that others know them too. It's why red lights function, not because you fear the police, but because you know that everyone else knows the rule and is going to stop. It's why children learn to play peekaboo, because the delight comes from that shared loop of I know that you know that I'm here. So today we'll explore the phenomenon of common knowledge. Steven Pinker is a cognitive scientist and linguist at Harvard, and he's a longtime best-selling author who is famous for illuminating the hidden structures of human thought and society. His new book dives into the puzzle of common knowledge, how it arises, why it matters, and what it reveals about the architecture of our social minds. Steven joins me now. So, Steve, we are an intensely social species, and there's a lot that has to happen in order to get us to coordinate as a result. And this is the thing you've been thinking about. So tell us, how do we coordinate as a species?
Well, any two agents who need to coordinate need common knowledge, the theme of the book. Common knowledge being the state where I know something, you know it, I know that you know it, you know that I know it, I know that you know that I know that you know it ad infinitum. Why? Because it isn't enough for each party to know what the other one is going to do, because the other party guessing what the first one is going to do may do something completely different. So just to be concrete, if we're going to rendezvous and we don't generate common knowledge by a conversation, let's say my cell phone goes dead, so each of us has to guess where the other one is going to go. It's not enough for me to know that you like to go to Starbucks, because you may know that I like to go to Pete's. And so if I go to Starbucks because that's where you're going to go, you might go to Pete's because you think that's where I'm going to go. Well, I know that. Okay, so I'll go to Pete's because Dave knows that I like to go to Pete's. But wait a sec, Dave knows that I know he likes to go to Starbucks, so he's going to go to Starbucks after all, and so on. Nothing short of actually blurting it out in each other's presence will get you on the same page. Some kind of public, perceptible, self-evident signal. That's what is needed for coordination.
You've, of course, spent much of your career studying language, and so you see language as one way of establishing that common knowledge. Give us a sense of that.
Yeah, you know that I'm trying to get you to believe something because you know that I'm saying something with the intent that you believe it. That's kind of what language is. So it's a common knowledge generator when it is something is blurted out. What got me interested in this whole topic is actually almost the converse, cases in which we try to avoid common knowledge when we don't say something in so many words, but we put our meaning between the lines. We count on our reader to connect the dots. We use euphemism or innuendo or hinting or beating around the bush or shilly-shallying, which is a lot of language. That's one of the reasons it took so long to get computers to understand language. If you simply parse who did what to whom based on the subject and the verb and the object, you're really not going to understand what people actually meant, such as, if you could pass the salt, that would be awesome. Okay, now you think about that. I mean, that doesn't make much sense. It wouldn't literally be awesome. And, it's not like you're just pondering possible worlds. That's not the meaning. Everyone knows what the meaning is. It's give me the salt. And a lot of language is like that. And linguists have long known it. But the question is why? What are we trying to accomplish when we avoid blurting something, what we want out in so many words? What I suggest is that we're avoiding common knowledge. That is, each one knows what the other one is doing, but you may not know that the other one knows that you know that they know. And that allows you to preserve a certain relationship. Relationships being coordination problems, as we mentioned at the top of the conversation. A relationship, like being friends, being lovers, being a supervisor and supervisee, being transaction partners, those are all matters of common knowledge. We're friends not because we signed a contract, but because each one knows that the other one knows that we're friends. And that can be threatened by certain things that could become common knowledge that contradict the basis of the friendship, like a sexual proposition. So why do people say things like, want to come up for Netflix and chill? Or you want to come up for coffee? When, let's say it's a man saying it to a woman, she wasn't born yesterday. She's a grown up. She knows what it means. But it's still way better than, hey, you want to come up and have sex? Which would be, make both parties, pretty uncomfortable. Even though would you like to come up for coffee doesn't make them uncomfortable. How come? That was the problem that I took up in a previous book, The Stuff of Thought, Language as a Window into Human Nature, which had a chapter called Games People Play on language as a window into social relationships. And in trying to figure out why we don't just blurt out what we mean. Other examples being, say, a veiled bride. Let's say you're trying to jump the queue in a restaurant and you slip the maitre d' a $20 bill and say, I was wondering if you might have a cancellation, or this is an important night for me. Is there any way to shorten my wait? Why don't people just say, if I give you $20, will you seat me right away? Or fundraising. I've seen this a lot at Harvard. I'm sure you've seen a similar thing where the dean will say to the rich people in the audience, we're counting on you to show leadership, to be a friend to the university. Instead of, the reason we're all here is we hope that you're going to open your checkbook and write us, a check for $5 million. It's another case where people don't say what they mean. Why not? And here's the answer that got me interested in common knowledge. And I've done studies to back this up, that if it's, do you want to come up for coffee? Well, she knows what he means. And, obviously he knows what he means. But does she know that he knows that she knows? With an innuendo, like, would you like to come up for coffee? She could think, well, maybe he thinks I'm naive. And if I said no, maybe he thinks, caffeine would keep me up. Even though she knows that she's turned down a sexual overture, he knows it as well, but he could not know whether she knows that he knows. And likewise, he could think, well, maybe she thinks I'm dense. Maybe she thinks that I think that she's just turned down coffee. They can maintain their platonic friendship with the common knowledge that it's just about companionship. Whereas if he said, do you want to come up for have sex? And she said no, they can never be platonic friends in the same way again. The intuition is it's out there, you can't take it back. And I suggest that technically what's happening is that the blurted out speech generates common knowledge. Common knowledge is the basis of our relationships, their coordination games. Euphemism and innuendo get a message across without generating common knowledge. And that's why we fall back on it so often.
Okay, so that's how we sometimes try to mask common knowledge. Tell us about how common knowledge is useful in society-wide, let's say with public demonstrations and politics and economics.
Yeah, a lot of our large-scale coordination, not just two friends or rendezvousing for coffee or agreeing to be platonic friends, but large-scale things like everyone recognizing money. Like, why do I accept a green piece of paper in exchange for something of value? Well, because I know that other people will accept it and give me something of value. Why would they do that? Well, they know that still other people would accept it. So the value of currency depends on common knowledge. Everyone knows it's worth something, and that's what makes it worth something. The fact that everyone knows it. A lot of power depends on common knowledge. There are laws, there's courts, there's a police force, there's a jail. But most of the time, people just follow the law, even though Big Brother isn't watching them 24/7. However, these things can change. It's not easy to change them when the basis of power or money is just common knowledge, because everyone has an interest in keeping up the common assumption. But sometimes it can unravel. In the case of power, if there is a public protest, everyone shows up at a public square at the same time, the same place. Everyone sees everyone else there. Previously, it may be that everyone was resentful of the system, thought it was inefficient and oppressive. They may even have suspected that everyone else had the same feeling, but they didn't know that other people knew that they knew. They couldn't coordinate by all kind of rising at the same time. And so the regime could keep them in their place by preventing common knowledge. And that's why dictators don't allow freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, precisely because they're afraid that people coordinating, which they could only do with common knowledge, could, acting together, overpower a regime. Likewise, in the case of going back to money, again, if the value of money depends on common knowledge, then when the common knowledge is threatened, the value of money can disappear. And that's what happens when you get hyperinflation. People taking home their wages in a wheelbarrow because no one will accept it anymore. Or a bank run where people withdraw their savings, not necessarily because they think that there's anything wrong with a bank, but as long as there's a rumor that other people think that there's a problem with the bank and they're withdrawing their money out of fear that still other people will withdraw their money, it suddenly becomes rational to withdraw your money while the bank still has money to withdraw. And that can cause a bank to fail. That can cause the whole economy to fail. That's what happened in 1929. And so when Roosevelt said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, he was stating a theorem of common knowledge. That was quite literally true, that what people had to fear was fear itself. And the fear of fear, the recursive fear, the common knowledge, could actually change the value of those financial institutions.
So here's something I wanted to dig in with you about after reading your book. How do we think about false common knowledge? By which I mean, let's imagine that you and I engage in a public protest and we look around and we see 1,000 people around us. We say, look, everybody clearly feels this way, but we're not aware that across town, there's a larger protest with 10,000 people in it. And we have the impression that everyone feels the same way we do about something.
I mean, that technically would be common belief rather than common knowledge, but different pools of people can have different common beliefs. And there can also be common misconceptions where prior to the protest, there are cases where people think that everyone else believes something. In fact, everyone can believe that everyone else believes something and no one actually believes it. Sometimes called a pluralistic ignorance or a spiral of silence.
What's an example of that?
A classic case, study of pluralistic ignorance in social psychology was when some psychologists interviewed the guys in a fraternity. They found that every one of them thought that it was really stupid to drink so much that you pass out, but everyone thought that all the other frat bros thought it was cool. No one actually thought it was cool, but everyone thought that all the others thought it was cool. And there are probably a lot of cases like that. I mean, an extreme case would be the Emperor's New Clothes, where everyone thought that everyone else thought that who were seeing clothes. No one actually saw clothes. And it took the little boy blurting it out, generating common knowledge for the common misconception to flip into common knowledge. The Emperor's New Clothes is a story about common knowledge. The boy wasn't telling anyone anything they didn't already know, but he was changing the state of their knowledge because now everyone knew that everyone else knew. And that changed their relationship with the emperor from deference to scorn and ridicule.
I do worry a little bit, though, about people assuming politically common knowledge and saying, hey, if I just make some innuendo, everyone will understand what I mean by this, because that often doesn't work, especially now.
Well, the thing about innuendo is that it has to be calibrated so that it is recognized by a kind of willing recipient, but can be denied by an unwilling recipient. So it has to be calibrated in that zone. And there can be errors in either direction, where there's an episode of Seinfeld where George Costanza is invited up for coffee and says no because he's got to get to work early the next morning. And then as he's walking out, he says, oh my God, coffee doesn't mean coffee. Coffee means sex. So there's the Costanza problem that it could be so subtle that it goes over the head. Or there could be, conversely, it's so blatant that the unwilling hearer calls you on it. Again, all of these things, by the way, are worked out in fiction, in comedies of manners, situation comedies. They kind of allow us to exercise our facility for recursive mentalizing, that is, getting inside the head of other people, getting inside the head of other people. And so they're often worked out. That's so often what drives fictional plots. But the opposite is when Harry met Sally, and Harry, early on, is kind of complimenting Sally. They just met kind of a little too insistently, and then she blows the whistle. She says, you're coming on to me, which leads to a wonderful discussion of common knowledge. I mean, not in those words, where he says, okay, let's say I was coming on to you. What are we going to do about it? I take it back, okay? I take it back. And she says, you can't take it back. He says, what do you mean you can't take it back? What are we going to do? Call the cops? And she says, it's out there. It's too late. So it's out there. That is a metaphor for common knowledge. That is, something that's out there is something that you see, other people see, you see them see it. And direct speech, or even in this case, indirect speech that was not indirect enough, it kind of exceeded the cutoff, is out there. And when it's out there, it changes the nature of the relationship. They were no longer just dear strangers, platonic friends. He had turned it into a sexual relationship, which you rebuffed.
Great. So I want to return for just a second to literature, which you mentioned, fictions, because I made the argument on this podcast a little while ago that I'm not so worried about AI completely taking the job of writers. And I listed 5 different reasons, but one of them had to do with the fact that we could all generate totally bespoke literature, just like kings of yesteryear would do. But we lose something there, which is that a big part of literature is the social glue, the fact that everyone else has read the same story. I don't want my Game of Thrones to have a different outcome than your Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, what is the reason we desire common knowledge so much?
I think it's a great example, and people may not remember that back in the 90s, when the internet first became a thing, there was the idea that you could dial in whatever ending to a story you wanted. That fiction would, movies would be the same. Everyone could watch the movie. Needless to say, it didn't take off, and I think it's the reason that you identified. Namely, part of the experience of art is that it's common knowledge. You know about something at the same time you know that everyone else knows about it. And that's what gives you something in common that can reinforce a social relationship, a friendship. You see a movie with friends, you talk about it with friends. And the common experience is one of those things that makes friends friends. They go through things together, they share common interests. The basis, the common knowledge that's the tacit basis of friendship is that there's a kind of a mind meld, even a body meld where we are in physical proximity, we hug, we shake hands, all the more intense in a romantic relationship.
Okay, so I want to return and dig in just a little on this point, because I'm fascinated by this about false common knowledge, what I'm calling that, or a misconception about it. So, for example, recently Charlie Kirk was assassinated in broad daylight. And if you look on X and if you look on Blue Sky, you find very different stories about that. And presumably the people who are tweeting or blue skying are thinking, hey, this is great. We have shared common knowledge, but you in fact have 2 groups of people. I'm exaggerating a little bit the difference, but you have different groups that have beliefs that they believe are shared by everybody. Just a 1-second example of this. My grandmother, I remember many years ago in Florida, said, I can't believe that so-and-so just won governor because I don't know anybody that voted for him. And it was true, of course. She didn't know anybody, but it doesn't mean that the majority of the state didn't vote for him nonetheless.
Yeah, common knowledge, or more accurately in a lot of these cases, is common belief. That is, you believe something, you believe that other people believe that you believe it, and so on, is relative to a network, a community which can be disconnected from another network. And the common knowledge is often generated, since none of us experience everything firsthand. In fact, for politics, we experience almost nothing firsthand. We read about it, we hear about it. If the sources are disjoint, then the pools of common knowledge within each of these networks could be disjoint. And that happens partly from social media, as even feeds within a platform, but even more so when they're different platforms like X versus Blue Sky. Or in the case of cable news, do you watch Fox News, or do you watch CNN, or do you watch MSNBC? So one of the issues I take up in the book, and this intersects with my interest in academic freedom and freedom of speech in another part of my life where I co-founded and I'm the co-president of the Council on Academic Freedom at Harvard. Why is free speech so important? And all the more so in a country. Why is freedom of speech enshrined in the First Amendment to the American Constitution? Freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. So what is it about speech that can be so threatening to a dictator? You might think, well, a dictator would be content to let people bitch and moan all they want. He's the one with the guns, and as Mao said, power comes out of the barrel of a gun. So why should a public protest or a critical editorial be so threatening to a dictator? Well, the reason is, as Gandhi said in the eponymous movie, he says to a British officer, in the end, you will leave because there's simply no way that 100,000 Englishmen can control 350 million Indians if the Indians refuse to cooperate. So that's just a truth about numbers. But it raises the question, how do you get 350 million people cooperating, or in this case, coordinating? Well, some public event, a demonstration where you're protesting, you can see everyone else protesting, and everyone can see everyone else. You know the time is now. A prominent public declaration, j'accuse, or an article, everyone knows now that it's public that everyone hates the regime, and people can either storm the palace or just refuse to work or to cooperate. And so dictators don't want that to happen. They want to prevent the generation of common knowledge, which is why police states control both public assembly and public media. I recount a joke from the era of the Soviet Union in which a man is handing out leaflets in Red Square. And of course, sure enough, the KGB arrest him. They take him back to headquarters, only to discover that these leaflets are blank sheets of paper. And they confirm, what is the meaning of this? And he says, what's there to say? It's so obvious. So that's a joke about common knowledge. Namely, he was being subversive because by the very act of just handing out leaflets, didn't matter what they said, that now everyone who accepted the leaflets, seeing everyone else accept the leaflet, they all knew that there was something to protest. And they didn't have to be told what it was because they knew privately what it was. The act of communication was that giving it out in a public square made the private knowledge common, and that was threatening to the regime, which is why, in a case of life imitating a joke, Putin's regime has arrested people for carrying blank signs.
I'm sorry to return to this point, but if you stood on a street corner and said, I'm protesting, and you handed out blank sheets of paper, the lefties would think one thing from the blank sheet and the righties would think another thing. And so in an ideal situation, we look at the Soviet regime as a failure, and so we say, okay, it was obvious what he meant by that. But I'm interested in the fact that we each have very different internal models, let's say with politics. And so the transmission of common knowledge isn't so easy in a sense.
Well, yes. It depends on a conspicuous public signal, and in general from a trusted source, and who trusts whom can vary between interconnected but disjoint networks of people. But it's not the case that everyone goes their own way. Otherwise, we wouldn't have society. We wouldn't have science. We wouldn't have markets. We wouldn't have currency.
But we do have two different parties. We do have two different parties that increasingly disagree more and more.
We do, yes. As I said, there can be the common belief within semi-disconnected networks within each of which you have common belief, but not necessarily in the entire group. The general phenomena are that common knowledge is generated by public signals that people see when they know that everyone else sees it and sees themselves seeing it. And again, that can be relative to the population and the connected network that sees each other seeing something at the same time. So
tell us about cancel culture, and also why cancel culture is more possible in a world where people can hide behind keyboards.
Yes. I have a chapter in the book called The Canceling Instinct, and it does touch on my interest in academic freedom. But the point of the chapter isn't so much to make the case for academic freedom, though I do reprise that, but as a psychologist, to ask, why is there an urge to censor, to cancel, to punish people for their opinions? Now, of course, that's been true for all of human history. Heretics have been burned at the stake or crucified. But you'd think that in universities of all places, the arena where we ought to be, not treat beliefs as sinful, maybe mistaken, maybe illogical, but then you point it out. Why do you try to destroy the person who's ventured that opinion? That's the phenomenon of cancel culture. And I suggest it's because they're a combination of two psychological phenomena. One of them is that even though the whole basis of science and scholarship is There is a truth. We have means to try to approach it. We may be mistaken, but we're not bad people because we're mistaken, that you believe things to the extent that there's good evidence for it, good arguments for it. That whole complex of beliefs is kind of weird in human history. And the more common attitude is, for most people, most of the time, is your beliefs are a reflection of who you are. Whether in particular what tribe you belong to and whether you're a good person, which usually means upholding the sacred beliefs of your tribe. Now that is poison for science and for scholarship and for academia, but it is the way that people think. That beliefs, putting aside beliefs about the here and now, people don't hallucinate. They know, there's food in the fridge, there isn't food in the fridge. But when it comes to more, bigger questions, where did humans come from? Why is there disease? Why are there revolutions? Why is there wealth and inequality? Things that we academics tend to think can be answered by the methods of science and scholarship. But most people, is what you believe signals what tribe, what coalition you belong to, and you're bad if you have the wrong belief. So if you have that kind of built-in flaw in human belief, then there can be norms as to what you believe and what you don't believe. And norms are matters of common knowledge. They exist because people believe they exist. They can be threatened if people flout them and get away with it. So, we have everyday social norms. You don't go around naked. You don't pass gas in public. You don't tell ethnic jokes anymore. You don't insult people's appearance to their face. All of these norms are held up just because it isn't done, and everyone knows that it isn't done. Conversely, if it is done, the norm can unravel. So people often feel the need to prop up norms by noting when they're flouted in public and then punishing the violator in public. And the punishment has to be public for it to prop up the norm, which is why we used to have public hangings and pillories and stocks and crucifixions. Only if you have everyone seeing that the person is punished could the norm survive. Well, I think we now have an equivalent, often an electronic equivalent, in social media, where if someone does flout a norm, that is, they express an opinion that goes against what you take to be the moral convictions of your tribe, people feel the urge to punish it in public, and that's really easy to do on social media.
And the anonymity of being behind the keyboard, I think, it's just like the trolley dilemma, where if you have to push the person with your hands, it's different. You activate these emotional networks and you're less likely to do that. But if you have to pull the lever so that only one person gets killed instead of 5 people, then most people are perfectly willing to do that at a distance. And it strikes me it's the same thing with the anonymity.
Well, that's right. And it also, this does relate to another common knowledge phenomenon, that is that our social relationships, are we friends? Are we lovers? Are we boss and subordinate? Are we neighbors, members of a civil society? A lot of these are reinforced by common knowledge generators. Eye contact, handshakes, laughter, blushing, eye contact, things that can't be denied. That is, you look someone in the eye, you're looking at the part of them that's looking at the part of you, that's looking at the part of them that's looking at the part of you ad infinitum. So eye contact is a common knowledge generator. And the common knowledge that these signals generate tend to be things like, well, we're all acting like we're members of a community. And so indeed, when those signals are present, because you're face to face, then that can restore the norms of how you deal with a person in a peer group. Namely, you don't insult them to your face. Without those common knowledge generators, such as in the anonymity of a keyboard, then you can insult people, you can denigrate them, you can try to destroy their reputations in a way that would be kind of unthinkable in a face-to-face situation.
There's one piece I want to return to about cancel culture, which is why everybody jumps on the bandwagon. You had a section in your book about moral condemnation and why it's better to join the bullies than to take the risk of being bullied.
Yeah.
Yeah. Give us a sense of that.
Exactly. I mean, it's a kind of a playground dynamic that many of us remember sometimes with shame when we may have joined the bullying mob and out of fear of becoming the kid that everyone picks on. And there's an equivalent in academia, sad to say, where, I mean, it has no place because we're all in it together trying to find the truth. But you get the instant petition with 600 signatures, which you can easily gin up on social media. There are enough grad students in the country that you can get to sign some condemnatory petition. But I think it is some of the same dynamic. And there is a dynamic. Sorry to keep relating things to common knowledge because it is the theme of the book, the theme of our conversation. But I do think that it governs many human interactions. But there's a theory from a former postdoc of mine, Peter Descholi, and his former advisor, Rob Kurzban, that no one is an island. We really want to be part of some group, some posse, some band of brothers, because we're sitting ducks if we're isolated. How do you know which group to join? You don't want to be on the losing side. If you can find some sin that someone has committed and you all jointly recognize that they are a sinner, they've broken some norm, some law, you gang up on them. And it's common knowledge that as you know that the other people recognize that same violation. It is a basis for forming a coalition. And people often will band together and to single out some victim and there's something that feels right about being in that band. And it is the basis that coalitions can form and the target suffers their kind of collateral damage. Probably the episode from fiction that kind of draws that out the most is the famous story by Shirley Jackson called The Lottery. It came out in the late 40s, often assigned in high school, and debated ever since, where the townfolk of a bucolic village every year choose someone by lottery and stone them to death, an innocent person, suggesting that there is some kind of human urge to simply gang up on a victim. They, in this case, what makes the story so chilling and so kind of absurd is the victim didn't actually do something other than being the loser in the lottery. But what it kind of played out, what continues to make it fascinating, is this dynamic of being part of a mob united in its victimization of a victim.
Yeah, so it doesn't only have to do with the violation, it has to do with the social bonding that results. Okay, great. What else should everybody know about common knowledge?
Yes. Well, one of my favorite chapters, the one that I had one of the most fun writing, was the one on body language, social signals, laughing, crying, blushing, staring, glaring, on signals that I think we evolved because they were common knowledge generators. So in the case of, why do we blush? Mark Twain said, man is the only animal that blushes or needs to. And he was right that humanity is the only animal that blushes. There are other things that also make humans unique. We're the only species that weeps. We're the only species that laughs. There's a kind of precursor in chimpanzees in a kind of panting that accompanies play fighting, but it's not like exactly the same as our laughter. Our eye contact is really important to humans, and that's probably why we evolved a white sclera, the whites of our eyes that other primates don't have. Why we have elongated eyes, so that our position of our eyes can easily be discerned. So all of these, I suggest, are effective because when you express them, the perceiver knows that you know that you're expressing them. So in the case of blushing, you feel the heat of your cheeks from the inside at the same time that you know that other people can see them redden from the outside. And they know that you're feeling it, because what makes blushing so painful is knowing that other people know that you're blushing. That's when people say, you're blushing, which makes people blush all the more. and can even make them blush if they're not blushing. Or tearing up, weeping. You're seeing the world through the kind of the scrim of your own tears, and other people can see the glisten or the trickle of your tears. So these are cases where I think you're establishing something about your relationship with the person in a involuntary, unfakeable, and undeniable way. In the case of blushing, it's, I know that I've screwed up by the norms that you hold. And so even though I've screwed up, better that I know that I've screwed up than that I just blow off your norms as if I was some kind of loose cannon or weirdo or psychopath. In the case of crying, it's, I acknowledge defeat, surrender, helplessness. I'm not going to fight back. It's kind of the bodily equivalent of raising a white flag or throwing in the towel in a boxing match. Anyway, I talk about each one of these displays and why I think they evolved as a common knowledge generator in order to ratify a certain kind of social relationship.
Excellent. Yeah, I loved that chapter. Okay, any closing thoughts about common knowledge?
Yeah, I think it's a missing piece of the puzzle of a lot of human life, that a lot of what seem to be arbitrary rituals, conventions, hypocrisies do have a hidden rationale in terms of either generating or denying common knowledge, including all of the ways in which we are systematically hypocritical, genteel, polite, dainty. We don't blurt out things that all of us know privately, but we don't know commonly. And that there's a reason for that. It's necessary to preserve and retain certain social relationships on which social life depends. And that, as certain comedies point out, where they envision a world in which someone or everyone is forced to be honest, it quickly becomes a dystopia, and the characters are glad to go back to a state in which you don't say everything that you mean.
That was my interview with Steven Pinker. His new book is called When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows: Common Knowledge and the Mysteries of Money, Power, and Everyday Life. The book tackles many mysteries of life and psychology centered on this question of how humans manage to coordinate on scales that range from 2 drivers in a game of chicken to millions of people in a nation. A lot of the answers lie in this recursive loop of awareness that we call common knowledge. Pinker shows us in the book that common knowledge is at least some of the engine behind laughter, applause, etiquette, trust, diplomacy, and financial markets. And common knowledge is the difference between 1,000 private doubts and a public turning point in history. Private knowledge lives in our skulls, but common knowledge spills into the shared spaces between us, and it's what transforms isolated individuals into a civilization. In our daily lives, we hardly notice it, but every time that we drive on the correct side of the road, or laugh at the same moment in the theater, or rise to our feet in a standing ovation, we're participating in a recursive dance of shared awareness. The thing that's so striking is how invisible it generally is to us. But common knowledge is the thread that binds strangers into this mad, wild, beautiful collective that we call society. Go to eagleman.com/podcast for more information and find further reading. Join the weekly discussions on my Substack, and check out and subscribe to Inner Cosmos on YouTube for videos of each episode and to leave comments. Until next time, I'm David Eagleman, and this is Inner Cosmos.